Sarah Martinez found her neighbor's severed finger in her morning coffee. The pale digit floated between the cream swirls like a macabre garnish, wedding ring still gleaming. She dropped the mug, porcelain shattering across her pristine kitchen floor. Her hands trembled as she stared at the grotesque discovery. Margaret Chun from next door had been missing for 3 days. The police had questioned everyone on Maple Street, including Sarah, who had provided them with a detailed timeline of her movements. She was always good with details, always prepared. The rational part of her mind screamed to call 911 immediately. Instead, Sarah found herself methodically cleaning up the coffee and ceramic shards, her movements precise and controlled. She wrapped the finger in a paper towel and placed it in a Ziploc bag, then stored it in her freezer between the frozen peas and vanilla ice cream. Why wasn't she panicking? The question disturbed her more than finding the severed appendage. Normal people would be screaming, vomiting, crying. Sarah felt nothing but cold calculation and a strange sense of satisfaction that her suspicions about her missing neighbor had been confirmed. Margaret had been the perfect neighbor for 2 years. She brought homemade cookies during holidays, watered Sarah's plants during vacations, and never complained about anything. Her perpetual kindness had irritated Sarah in ways she couldn't explain. There was something artificial about Margaret's constant cheerfulness, something that triggered Sarah's instincts like fingernails on a chalkboard. Sarah had begun watching Margaret through her kitchen window, documenting her routines in a leather journal. Margaret left for her morning jog at exactly 6:15 a.m., returned at 7 a.m., and always waved at Sarah's window with the same mechanical smile. She received flowers every Tuesday from an unknown sender, always throwing them away untouched on Wednesday mornings. The more Sarah observed, the more convinced she became that Margaret was hiding something sinister. The way she spoke to her plants with mock tenderness, the way she collected stray cats only to have them disappear within weeks, the way she stared too long at children playing in the neighborhood park. 3 mornings ago, Margaret hadn't emerged for her jog. Sarah had waited by her window until 8 a.m., then knocked on Margaret's door. No answer. The house felt empty, but Margaret's car remained in the driveway. Sarah had called the police that afternoon, playing the role of concerned neighbor perfectly. Now, staring at her freezer, Sarah wondered if she had been wrong about Margaret. Maybe her neighbor had been the victim all along, and the real predator lived much closer than anyone suspected. The thought should have terrified her, but instead sent an electric thrill through her nervous system. Sarah made herself another cup of coffee, this time checking the mug thoroughly before adding cream. She sat at her kitchen table and opened her journal, reviewing her notes about Margaret's behavior patterns. Every detail was recorded in her neat handwriting, dates and times precisely documented. She flipped to a fresh page and began writing about finding the finger. Her handwriting remained steady, clinical. She noted the temperature of the coffee, the appearance of the severed digit, her own physical and emotional responses, or lack thereof. The doorbell rang at 2:30 p.m. Sarah closed her journal and walked calmly to answer it. Detective Rodriguez stood on her porch, his expression grim. He was the same officer who had taken her statement about Margaret's disappearance. "Ms. Martinez, we found Margaret Chen's body this morning," he said, studying Sarah's face carefully. "I wanted to inform you personally since you were the one who reported her missing." Sarah arranged her features into an expression of shock and grief. "Oh my God, what happened to her?" "We can't release details yet, but it appears to be homicide. We're interviewing everyone in the neighborhood again. Would you mind answering a few more questions?" "Of course, anything to help." Sarah stepped aside, inviting him into her immaculate living room. Detective Rodriguez settled into her beige sofa, pulling out his notepad. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the past few days? Any strangers in the neighborhood, unfamiliar cars, anything that seemed out of place?" Sarah provided a detailed account of her observations, careful to include only information that couldn't be verified or contradicted. She mentioned seeing a dark sedan parked 2 streets over that she hadn't recognized, described hearing what might have been arguing voices late one evening, expressed concern about recent break-ins in nearby neighborhoods. "You're very observant," Detective Rodriguez noted, his pen moving across the notepad. "I work from home, so I notice things," Sarah replied. "I suppose I've become the unofficial neighborhood watch." After 45 minutes of questions, the detective closed his notepad and stood to leave. "If you think of anything else, please call immediately. And Ms. Martinez, be careful. Until we catch whoever did this, everyone in this neighborhood could be at risk." Sarah walked him to the door, maintaining her concerned citizen facade until his car disappeared down the street. Then she returned to her kitchen and removed the Ziploc bag from her freezer. She held Margaret's finger up to the afternoon light streaming through her window. The flesh had begun to turn gray, but the diamond wedding ring still sparkled. Margaret had never mentioned a husband, never wore the ring except on her left hand's middle finger. Another mystery that had intrigued Sarah during her months of observation. Sarah realized she felt more alive examining this severed piece of her neighbor than she had felt in years. The discovery had awakened something dormant inside her, something that had been sleeping beneath her carefully maintained normal exterior. She rewrapped the finger and returned it to the freezer. Tomorrow she would decide what to do with her macabre evidence. Tonight, she would review her journals and try to understand why finding proof of evil in her neighborhood filled her with such profound satisfaction. Lisa Thompson's obsession with the murder next door had consumed 3 weeks of her life. She pressed her face against the cold basement window, watching crime scene investigators pack up their equipment from Margaret Chun's house. The yellow tape fluttered in the October wind like festive ribbons celebrating death. Her laptop screen glowed behind her, displaying dozens of browser tabs about the case. Local news articles, police scanner recordings, social media speculation from neighborhood groups. Lisa had collected every fragment of information like pieces of a puzzle she was desperate to solve. The basement had become her command center. She'd moved her computer desk to face the window. arranged her research materials in careful stacks, and installed blackout curtains so she could observe without being seen. Her husband, David, thought she was working on freelance graphic design projects down here. He had no idea she spent 18 hours a day researching murder. Lisa's fixation had started innocently enough. She'd been genuinely. The brutality of the crime in their quiet suburb had shaken everyone. But while her neighbors installed security systems and avoided evening walks, Lisa felt energized by the proximity to violence. She'd started following the investigation online, then began her own amateur detective work. Lisa created spreadsheets tracking every resident on their street, documenting alibis and suspicious behaviors. She'd even purchased a high-powered telescope to monitor activities in neighboring yards. The most intriguing neighbor was Sarah Martinez, the woman who'd reported Margaret missing. Lisa had observed Sarah's unnaturally calm demeanor during police interviews, noticed how she always seemed prepared with detailed answers. While other neighbors appeared genuinely distressed, Sarah projected a composed facade that seemed almost rehearsed. Lisa had begun following Sarah's daily routines, timing her grocery trips and documenting her visitors. Sarah lived alone, worked from home, and maintained an eerily pristine lifestyle. Everything about her seemed too perfect, too controlled. Lisa's instincts screamed that Sarah was hiding something significant. 3 days ago, Lisa had witnessed something that changed everything. She'd been monitoring Sarah's backyard through her telescope when she saw Sarah digging near her rose garden at 2 a.m. The behavior was bizarre enough to warrant closer investigation. Lisa had waited until Sarah left for errands the next morning, then climbed the fence separating their properties. She'd examined the freshly turned soil, finding it suspiciously soft and recently disturbed. Unable to resist, she'd begun digging with her bare hands. 6 inches down, her fingers had touched something that made her gasp. Fabric. Designer fabric that looked expensive and familiar. Lisa had recognized it immediately as the yellow blouse Margaret Chen had been wearing the day before her disappearance. She'd seen Margaret gardening in that exact shirt through her telescope. Instead of calling police immediately, Lisa had carefully reburied the evidence and returned home. She'd spent hours pacing her basement, wrestling with the implications of her discovery. Sarah Martinez, their composed and helpful neighbor, was likely Margaret's killer. The rational response would be reporting her findings to Detective Rodriguez. But Lisa found herself paralyzed by a complex mixture of fear and fascination. She'd stumbled onto proof of murder, and the knowledge felt like holding a live grenade. More disturbing was her own reaction to the discovery. Lisa expected to feel horror or panic, but instead experienced an intoxicating rush of excitement. She'd uncovered a real killer, solved a mystery that had stumped police. The power of that knowledge was intoxicating. Lisa began documenting Sarah's every movement with increased intensity. She purchased additional surveillance equipment, installed motion sensors in her backyard, and created detailed behavioral profiles. Her research consumed her completely, replacing sleep and normal social interactions. David had started asking questions about her extended basement sessions and lack of appetite. Lisa deflected his concerns with lies about demanding client projects and looming deadlines. She couldn't explain that she was too excited about tracking a murderer to focus on mundane tasks like cooking or sleeping. Yesterday evening, Lisa had witnessed Sarah disposing of something in her garbage bin after dark. Through her telescope, she'd watched Sarah double-bag a small package and bury it deep beneath other trash. The secretive behavior confirmed Lisa's suspicions and presented an opportunity. This morning, after Sarah left for her weekly grocery run, Lisa had retrieved a mysterious package from the garbage. Inside the double bags, she'd found Margaret's jewelry. A distinctive silver bracelet, pearl earrings, and the wedding ring Margaret wore on her middle finger. Lisa now sat in her basement, staring at the stolen jewelry spread across her desk. She had concrete evidence linking Sarah to Margaret's murder. The logical next step was contacting police and providing everything she'd discovered. Instead, Lisa found herself Googling how to preserve evidence and researching blackmail techniques. The thought of confronting Sarah directly sent adrenaline coursing through her system. She imagined the shock in Sarah's eyes when presented with proof of her crimes, the power dynamic that would shift in Lisa's favor. Her phone buzzed with a text from David asking about dinner plans. Lisa ignored it, too absorbed in planning her next move to consider normal domestic concerns. She'd lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks, existing primarily on coffee and the electric energy of her obsession. Lisa opened a new browser tab and began researching Sarah's background more thoroughly. She discovered Sarah had moved to their neighborhood 2 years ago, shortly before Margaret's arrival. Previous addresses were scattered across different states, suggesting a pattern of frequent relocation. The more Lisa investigated, the more convinced she became that Margaret hadn't been Sarah's first victim. The methodical way she disposed of evidence, her calm demeanor during police questioning, her prepared responses to every inquiry suggested experience with murder. Lisa realized she wasn't just tracking one killer's recent crime. She'd potentially discovered a serial murderer who'd been operating undetected for years. The magnitude of her discovery was overwhelming and thrilling. As afternoon shadows lengthened across her basement, Lisa made her decision. Tomorrow morning, she would confront Sarah Martinez with the evidence. Not to seek justice or protect potential future victims, but to satisfy her own desperate need to look evil directly in the eyes and understand how it operated. Rachel Foster's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached Sarah Martinez's front door. The evidence folder clutched in her sweaty palms contained photographs, timeline documents, and Margaret's recovered jewelry. 3 weeks of obsessive investigation had led to this moment of truth. She'd been watching from her basement window when the real Lisa Thompson returned from vacation that morning. Rolling her suitcase up the driveway of the house Rachel had been surveilling for weeks. The shock of realizing she'd been monitoring the wrong woman had sent Rachel into a spiral of panic and confusion. Rachel had constructed an elaborate fantasy around the composed brunette she'd observed through her telescope. She'd convinced herself that Sarah Martinez was a calculated killer, created detailed profiles of her suspicious behaviors, even retrieved what she believed was evidence from Sarah's garbage. The discovery that she'd been watching Lisa Thompson's house instead of Sarah's had shattered her carefully built narrative. But Rachel couldn't abandon her investigation now. She'd invested too much time and energy to accept that she'd been wrong about everything. The jewelry was real, the disturbed soil was real, and her instincts about hidden evil in their neighborhood remained strong. She'd simply identified the wrong suspect. Rachel had spent the morning repositioning her surveillance equipment and researching the actual Sarah Martinez, whose house sat 2 doors down from Lisa's. Sarah's real residence was a modest blue colonial with well-maintained landscaping and drawn curtains that never opened during daylight hours. The few glimpses Rachel had caught of the real Sarah revealed a pale, thin woman who moved with deliberate precision. Unlike her fantasy version, this Sarah rarely appeared outdoors and seemed to actively avoid contact with neighbors. Her reclusiveness struck Rachel as far more suspicious than any fabricated evidence she'd collected. Rachel rang the doorbell and waited, adjusting her grip on the folder. Footsteps approached slowly, followed by the sound of multiple locks disengaging. The door opened to reveal a woman with hollow cheeks and intelligent eyes that assessed Rachel with uncomfortable intensity. "Can I help you?" Sarah's voice was softer than Rachel had expected, almost musical. "I'm Rachel Foster from down the street. I wondered if we could talk about Margaret Chen's murder." Rachel struggled to keep her voice steady under Sarah's piercing gaze. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened imperceptibly on the doorframe. "That was very tragic. I didn't know Margaret well. I think you knew her better than you're admitting." Rachel opened her folder, revealing the photographs she'd taken of disturbed soil and recovered jewelry. "I found these buried in what I thought was your yard." Sarah studied the images without apparent surprise or concern. Her calm reaction unnerved Rachel more than outright denial would have. "Those items don't belong to me. Where exactly did you find them?" Rachel realized her mistake immediately. By admitting to trespassing and evidence tampering, she'd compromised any legal value her discoveries might have possessed. Worse, she'd revealed herself as an unstable neighbor conducting illegal surveillance. "I was investigating Margaret's disappearance," Rachel explained, her confidence evaporating. "Someone in this neighborhood killed her, and I'm going to find out who. Come inside." Sarah stepped back, gesturing for Rachel to enter. "We should discuss this privately." Rachel hesitated at the threshold, suddenly aware of how isolated and vulnerable she'd made herself. She'd told no one about confronting Sarah, hadn't left any record of her suspicions. If Sarah was indeed dangerous, Rachel had walked directly into a trap. But her obsession with solving the murder overrode rational caution. Rachel stepped into Sarah's living room, immediately struck by its sterile atmosphere. The space felt more like a medical facility than a home, with white walls, minimal furniture, and no personal decorations. "You've been watching the wrong house," Sarah said, closing the door behind them. "Lisa Thompson just returned from visiting her sister in Portland. She's been gone for 3 weeks." Rachel's stomach dropped. "How do you know that?" "Because I make it my business to know what happens in this neighborhood. Unlike you, I don't make assumptions based on incomplete information. Sarah gestured for Rachel to sit on the pristine white sofa. Someone killed Margaret, Rachel insisted, perching nervously on the edge of the cushion. The police aren't making progress, so I decided to investigate myself. Sarah settled into an armchair across from her, movements graceful and predatory. What makes you think Margaret is dead? The question caught Rachel off guard. The police found her body. It was in all the news reports. They found a body they identified as Margaret Chen, but how carefully? Did you examine those reports? How thoroughly did you verify the information? Rachel stared at Sarah, confusion mixing with growing dread. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you're very observant, but draw conclusions too quickly. You saw disturbed soil and assumed someone buried evidence. You found jewelry and assumed it belonged to a murder victim. You watched a house for weeks and assumed you were monitoring the right person. Sarah's voice remained conversational, but her words carried an underlying menace that made Rachel's skin crawl. She began to understand that confronting this woman had been a serious mistake. Margaret Chun isn't dead, Sarah continued. She's very much alive and living comfortably in a location where she can't be found by people who might harm her. That's impossible. The police confirmed what I wanted them to confirm. Margaret was in danger from someone in this neighborhood, someone who'd been stalking her for months. I helped her disappear before that person could hurt her. Rachel's mouth went dry. Who was stalking her? Sarah smiled for the first time since Rachel's arrival. The expression was cold and calculating. You were, Rachel. Your obsessive surveillance, your evidence collection, your determination to find a killer where none existed. Margaret noticed you watching her house, following her routines, documenting her movements. The accusation hit Rachel like physical blow. I was investigating after she disappeared. You were investigating long before that. Margaret showed me photographs she'd taken of you watching her through your telescope. She was terrified. Rachel realized that every assumption she'd made had been wrong. Her investigation hadn't uncovered a murderer's secrets. It had revealed her own disturbing behavior. She'd become the neighborhood threat she'd been so desperate to identify. Diana Blackwood stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, no longer recognizing the woman looking back. 3 sleepless weeks had carved hollow shadows under her eyes and sharpened her cheekbones into blade-like edges. The obsession that had consumed her life was finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. She'd spent the morning reviewing everything Rachel Foster had discovered about Margaret Chun's supposed murder. Rachel's evidence folder lay open on Diana's kitchen table, its contents revealing a disturbing pattern of surveillance and manufactured paranoia. The jewelry Rachel had found wasn't stolen from a murder victim. It belonged to Diana herself, planted strategically to support a narrative she'd been crafting for months. Diana had been watching Rachel's descent into obsession with professional fascination. As a forensic psychologist, she understood the psychological mechanisms that drove people toward dangerous fixations. What she hadn't anticipated was how addictive it would become to orchestrate another person's mental breakdown. The elaborate deception had started as an academic exercise. Diana had recently moved to the neighborhood to escape her own troubled past, seeking anonymity in suburban normalcy. But normal had never suited her, and she'd found herself studying her neighbors like specimens in a psychological laboratory. Margaret Chun had been the perfect subject for Diana's experiment. Isolated, routine-driven, and surrounded by neighbors who barely knew her name. Diana had befriended Margaret gradually, learning her habits and vulnerabilities while posing as Sarah Martinez, an identity she'd constructed using forged documents and careful social engineering. The plan had been elegantly simple. Diana would help Margaret disappear, then observe how the neighborhood responded to an unexplained absence. She'd planted evidence to suggest violence, fed information to police that would misdirect their investigation, and watched with clinical detachment as fear took root in her community. Rachel's surveillance had been an unexpected bonus. Diana had noticed Rachel's obsessive tendencies early, recognizing the symptoms of developing paranoid behavior. Instead of discouraging Rachel's investigation, Diana had subtly encouraged it by providing false clues and staged evidence. Every piece of jewelry Rachel discovered, every suspicious activity she witnessed, every disturbing detail she uncovered had been carefully orchestrated by Diana. She'd transformed Rachel from a stable suburban mother into a paranoid stalker, demonstrating how easily ordinary people could be manipulated into destructive behavior. Margaret was indeed alive, living comfortably in a rental property Diana had secured 3 states away. She believed she'd been rescued from a dangerous stalker and had no idea she'd been the unwilling centerpiece of a psychological experiment. Margaret sent grateful texts weekly, thanking her savior for providing the fresh start she desperately needed. But the experiment had evolved beyond Diana's original parameters. What began as professional curiosity had awakened something darker in her psychology. She'd discovered an intoxicating pleasure in manipulating others, in wielding invisible control over their thoughts and actions. Diana had spent years studying criminal psychology, interviewing murderers and psychopaths for her research. She'd always maintained professional distance, analyzing their behavior patterns with academic objectivity. Now she understood their perspective from the inside, felt the addictive rush of power that came from orchestrating another person's destruction. The revelation terrified and thrilled her simultaneously. Diana realized she'd crossed a line from observer to participant, from researcher to predator. The knowledge should have prompted immediate self-reflection and behavioral correction. Instead, it made her hungry for more elaborate manipulations. Rachel's confrontation that afternoon had provided Diana with exquisite satisfaction. Watching Rachel realize that she'd become the neighborhood threat she'd been hunting was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Diana had transformed an innocent woman into a paranoid stalker, then revealed the transformation in a moment of devastating clarity. But the game was becoming too dangerous to continue. Rachel's erratic behavior was attracting police attention, and Detective Rodriguez had begun asking more sophisticated questions about the timeline of events. Diana's carefully constructed Sarah Martinez identity wouldn't withstand intensive investigation. She needed to end the experiment before it exposed her true nature. Diana had already prepared her exit strategy, researching new locations where she could establish fresh identities and find new subjects for her psychological studies. The Suburban experiment had taught her valuable lessons about manipulation and control that she was eager to apply on a larger scale. Diana opened her laptop and began composing a final message to Margaret, explaining that new threats had emerged and she needed to relocate again for safety. Margaret would comply without question, trusting the woman who'd saved her from imaginary danger. Next, Diana crafted an anonymous tip to police suggesting that Rachel Foster had been stalking Margaret Chen for months before her disappearance. She included photographs of Rachel's surveillance equipment and detailed records of her obsessive behavior. The evidence would redirect police attention away from Sarah Martinez and toward the psychologically unstable woman who'd inserted herself into their investigation. As Diana prepared to abandon her current identity, she reflected on the profound transformation the experiment had produced in her own psychology. She'd entered this neighborhood as a researcher studying criminal behavior. She was leaving as something far more dangerous, someone who'd discovered an appetite for psychological manipulation and the intelligence to pursue it systematically. The suburban houses around her contained dozens of potential subjects, people whose lives could be redirected with the right combination of fear, suggestion, and manufactured evidence. Diana had proven that ordinary individuals could be transformed into paranoid stalkers, dangerous obsessives, or unstable threats with relatively simple interventions. Tomorrow she would disappear, leaving behind the identity of Sarah Martinez and the psychological wreckage of Rachel Foster's life. Somewhere else, she would establish new identities and begin fresh experiments, each one more sophisticated than the last. Diana smiled at her reflection, finally recognizing the woman in the mirror. She was no longer a researcher studying evil from academic distance. She had become the evil she'd spent years analyzing, and the transformation felt like coming home. The only question now was which neighborhood would host her next psychological experiment, and which innocent residents would become unwilling participants in her evolving understanding of human manipulation and control.